So such is the person, رَجُلَانِ تَحَابَّا فِي اللَّهِ. Notice in the hadith the Prophet ﷺ mentions two people. However, there are 7 categories, so this would mean 8 people. But rather here what the Prophet ﷺ is referring to, out of the 7, meaning 7 categories. So these 2 people are 2 people that have undertaken and applied one particular quality and characteristic, and that is the love for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then the 5th quality which the Prophet ﷺ says, وَرَجُلٌ دَعَتْهُ امْرَأَةُ ذَاتُ مَنْصِبٍ وَجَمَالٍ فَقَالَ إِنِّي أَخَافُ اللَّهِ. He says, a man who was called by a woman of beauty and position, but he says, I fear Allah. Meaning, a man who was called by a woman of beauty and position to commit an illegal act, but this man says, I fear Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala. And out of his fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and refraining from this act of disobedience and act of displeasure to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will grant him shade under the shade of his throne on the day which there is no shade except his shade. And let us now mention the story of one great man in our history who, his name was Ata, and this man Ata and his brother Sulaiman bin Yasar, they were on their way to Hajj, and they were in the city of Medina, just outside Medina. And they were along with some of their companions. When they reached the outskirts of the city, they stopped at a particular house to rest. And as Ata was inside, Sulaiman and his companions went to see to some of their needs. And so Ata remained, the brother of Sulaiman, Ata remained in the house praying to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then it's reported that whilst he was praying, one of the women of the Bedouins, who was attractive, came into the house. And she entered upon him. And so when he noticed her, he thought that perhaps she has some need that he may need to be able to help her with. And so he was quick to finish his prayer and gave salam, and then asked the woman what is it that she came for, in order that he may be able to assist her. And so she said, yes. And he said, what is that need? And so she said to him, come and have your share for me, for I am filled with desire and I do not have a spouse. So meaning she's calling him to commit the illegal act. And so at this, he says, get away from me, and do not be a cause for me to burn in the hellfire. So, get away from me, and do not be the cause for me to burn in the hellfire alongside with you, if we fall into such an act. And so she continued to try and persuade this man, Ata, this salih, this pious man who feared Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And with her increasing persuasion and trying to influence him, all he could do was weep and cry out of fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that Allah ta'ala has placed him in this place of tribulation and test. And he continues weeping and he repeats, he says, woe be to you, get away from me. And so he continues to repel her from him. And his weeping intensifies to a point where the woman herself, she starts to cry. She starts to cry and to weep in making tawbah to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because the hal of this man, the state of this man and his muraqabah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because a person's remembrance and dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and his watchful eye over him will be a means to bring a person out of act of disobedience when an act of disobedience presents itself to him. And a person who is in ghafla, then it will be easy for him to disobey Allah. But a person who is hadir of Allah, a person who is observing Allah and witnessing Allah and with Allah tabarak wa ta'ala, and Allah is with him, then he'll be someone who will be protected inshaAllah tabarak wa ta'ala from this act of disobedience. And so this man Ata, this Salih Ata, and this woman who has come to entice him, they are both now weeping. They're weeping and crying. And then his brother Sulaiman comes after fulfilling his needs outside, and he enters the house. And he finds they're both crying, and he sits down and he starts crying. He doesn't know why they're crying. And then the friends that are outside, they hear the crying outside. They come inside one by one and they sit down. They don't know why they're crying, but they're affected by the hal of these people, ma'Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And they sit down crying. So a state which was going to be a state of disobedience to Allah is now a state of khashya and khawf of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, such that it permits the crying before Allah and the weeping before Allah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for the sins that a person may have committed or may have been able to commit, but he's been prevented by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so when the weeping intensified and increased, the woman said, I give up, and there's no more room for disobedience. And so she gets up and she leaves. And likewise the rest of the companions leave. And Ata''s brother, who was younger than him, Sulaiman, he doesn't ask him. He doesn't ask him as to why he was weeping. because of his haiba, his aura about him. He doesn't ask him because he was older than him. And so, after a certain time, they proceed to Egypt, both Ata and Sulaiman, to attend to another one of their needs. And so, as they remain there for a particular time, one night, Ata and Sulaiman are there in the house, and he finds that Ata was asleep and then wakes up crying and weeping. And so Sulaiman wakes up and he notices his brother Ata crying and weeping. And so he asks him, what is it that you're crying for and about? And so his weeping intensifies, and he says, tonight I had a dream. And he says, what did you see in this dream? What was it? And so Ata reports the dream to him, and he says, I saw in this dream that Sayyidina Yusuf alayhi salam, Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam, was there amongst a group of people. And he was looking at this group of people, and everyone was looking at Sayyidina Yusuf alayhi salam. And I was also staring at Sayyidina Yusuf alayhi salam. And when I saw his beauty, the beauty of Sayyidina Yusuf, I began to weep. And then he looked at me, he says, Sayyidina Yusuf looked at me. And out of all the people, he says, why are you weeping? Directing his speech to Ata, why are you weeping? And so he says, I weep. He says, may my father and mother be ransomed for you, O Yusuf, O Prophet of Allah. He says, I remembered the wife of Al-Aziz, and I remembered how beautiful you were and how much beauty Allah Ta'ala had given you. And I remember how you were tested with her. And I also remember what you experienced of torment and punishment and imprisonment, and how you were separated from your father Yaqub for all those years. And I remembered all of this in this tribulation, and I began weeping and crying for this particular reason. And so Yusuf alayhi salam, he says to him, will you not then be even more amazed by the one who was with that beautiful Bedouin woman on the outskirts of the city, but rejected her, and referring to his case where he had in that house in which he began weeping, and then that woman herself became someone who was weeping as well. And so he realized what he was referring to, and so he woke up, and his brother Sulaiman saw him weeping. And at that point, Sulaiman asked him, he says, my brother, what was the situation with this woman? And so it was at that point that Ata, his brother, told him what had happened with the woman and how she had tried to call him to that which was illegal, but he refused, and he began crying out of fear of Allah, and then she began crying, and so then he came in and he saw them in that particular state. And he said to him, do not tell anyone about this particular story as long as I live. So as long as Ata lived, Sulaiman told nobody about the story until he died, his brother died, then he told one of the women of his family regarding the story, and then after that, the story was then transmitted and was shared amongst the people. But such, the muraqabah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the khawf of Allah, and the fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala affects the hearts of the believers and those who know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is watching their every step. In a society in which we are called to commit acts of displeasure to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and acts which the Sharia does not accept and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not pleased with, acts which will break up families and which will break up children and which will break up entire societies, and which will allow the modesty and the shyness to be removed entirely from society. This is what we face in our day and age. In any society in which we go, this is what we face. Whether it's the purest of society or the most impure of societies, you cannot be safe. Why? Because even in the most pure of societies, there will be a way for the shaitan, for the evil to enter. And for evil to come to a person, you don't have to go to it. Evil will come to you. But for good to come, you have to go to good. You have to go out and make the effort to go and seek the good and seek the pious people. But the people of corruption, the people who have no haya, no modesty and no morals, they will come to you. Even if you don't ask them, they will come to you in person, they will come to you in image, they will come to you in sound, they will come to you in any form, either via television or via DVD or via internet, via advertisement, or via newspaper, or via magazine, or via catalogue, whatever it may be. The shadow will come, the corruption and the evil will come, but how are you before this evil? And how are you before these images that come to you? And so the first thing that you should do is turn your gaze away from these. But if your gaze is already looking at these, then you must remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and also turn away and take the advice of Allah and the instruction of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He gives to the believers in Surah An-Nur to lower from their gaze, and likewise for the believing women to also lower from their gaze and to adorn themselves with their modest dress and to cover that which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has ordered to be covered. And in an age in which men start to cover more and women start to uncover more, men start to wear more and women start to uncover more, meaning that they wear less, and so the the principles of Islam have been reversed, and what is right becomes wrong, and what is wrong becomes right. And one of the signs of freedom of a woman automatically becomes that she free herself from the veil, because automatically, all of a sudden, for a woman were to wear a veil, or to wear a hijab, were to cover her hair or to cover her face, then she is automatically now an object of oppression and a symbol of oppression. How so? If such a person is someone who finds it her choice to take upon this garment and to take upon this gown and this clothing, and in answering the call and the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then she's someone who's free. She's no longer bound by the oppression of this dunya, who tells her this season you have to wear this particular fashion, but next season you have to wear something else because everyone else is wearing. There is no one that is oppressed except such a woman, because now she is dictated to by the men who are designing the clothes in those in those lands of wealth and